The weight of steel. The steel beam groaned under Jake McNiece's boots as he crouched in the pre-dawn fog, his fingers working over the tangle of detonation cord that should have brought down the entire railway bridge 12 hours ago. Instead, the span stood, damaged but passable, while the distant rumble of German armor grew louder through the Norman countryside. His TNT satchel lay half-submerged in the muddy creek below, soaked from a mist drop that had scattered the filthy 13 across 3 miles of hedgerow hell. The primer McNiece salvaged from his waterlogged pack felt slick between his fingers, and he knew he had maybe 20 minutes before the first panzer column reached this crossing. The mission brief had been clean: drop 2 miles east of the railway bridge, move to target, plant charges on the main support columns, and detonate before German reinforcements could reach the advancing American armor. Simple enough for the 506th's most unpredictable demolition squad. But the C-47 had taken flak over the Normandy drop zone, scattering paratroopers across flooded farmland and leaving McNiece's carefully planned explosives spread from here to the next village. "Rodriguez is in bad shape, Sergeant," Private Kowalski whispered from the tree line. "Kid's leg is twisted, something awful." McNiece glanced toward the shattered oak where Rodriguez lay unconscious, his face pale in the lifting fog. The private had followed him through the hedgerows for 6 hours, carrying what salvageable TNT they could find, until a German patrol forced them into this creek bed. 3 MG-42 bursts had sent them diving for cover, and Rodriguez hadn't gotten up. "We can't move him far," McNiece said, examining the bridge's foundation through the mist. "And we can't leave this span for the tanks." The irony wasn't lost on him. For months, officers had written him up for insubordination, questioned his methods, called the filthy 13 undisciplined. Now those same officers were counting on his ability to improvise under pressure, to turn chaos into opportunity when the textbook solutions lay scattered across Norman mud. He had 2 blocks of Composition B, a handful of primers, and 30 feet of det cord that might be dry enough to fire. Not enough to drop the entire span, but maybe sufficient to weaken the central support beam enough that the first tank across would bring the whole thing down. Tank engines echoed off the hills now, distinct and getting closer. McNiece spliced the damp det cord with practiced fingers, ignoring the tremor in his hands, not from fear, but from 48 hours without real sleep, living on cold coffee and the stubborn determination that had kept him alive through Sicily and Anzio. "Sergeant," Kowalski said quietly, "what if the charges don't hold?" McNiece looked at the kid's face, saw his own doubt reflected there. The steel beam above caught the first rays of sunlight, its damaged surface gleaming like a broken promise. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. Lieutenant Carson arrived as McNiece was rigging the second charge, moving through the morning fog with 2 more paratroopers from Easy Company. The officer's uniform was torn and mud-stained, his map case hanging loose from a shredded strap. "McNiece, what's your assessment?" Carson asked, crouching beside the bridge abutment. "Not good, sir. Lost most of my charges in the drop. What I've got might weaken the span, but it won't guarantee a clean collapse." Carson studied the steel beam rising through the mist, then glanced at his watch. "Regiment says German armor is moving up 3 separate roads. This bridge is the only direct route to link up with their units pushing against our boys at Carrington." McNiece continued working the detonation cord, his fingers moving automatically, while his mind calculated blast patterns and structural weak points. The Composition B felt solid against the beam's stress fractures, but he was working with half the explosive power he'd normally use for a target this size. "Sir," Kowalski interrupted, "what about Rodriguez? Kid needs medical attention." "We'll get him out," Carson said, but his voice carried doubt. Radio traffic suggested the scattered drop had left half the 506th cut off from their objectives, and medical teams were spread thin across the Bocage country. A rifle shot cracked through the morning air, followed by harsh German voices. Patrol, maybe 100 yards upstream, working along the creek bed where mist still clung to the water. McNiece froze against the abutment, one hand on the incomplete firing circuit. "How long do you need?" Carson whispered. 5 minutes to finish the placement, maybe 3 more to string the firing wire to safe distance. The German voices grew closer, accompanied by the splash of boots in shallow water. Through gaps in the rubble, McNiece could see Rodriguez stirring, his eyes wide but alert. The kid understood the situation without words. Any sound might bring the patrol down on them. Carson checked his carbine and signaled the Easy Company men to flanking positions. "We hold here until you're ready," he said to McNiece, "no matter what." McNiece had spent 2 years learning to trust his instincts about explosives, about timing, about the precise moment when preparation met opportunity. The charges weren't perfect, positioned where he'd normally place them, but they were set where the bridge wanted to fail. Sometimes that had to be enough. He thought about the steel mills back in Oklahoma, watching his father test welds and joints, learning that every structure had its breaking point if you understood where to apply pressure. The Normandy countryside was littered with blown bridges and cratered roads, testament to the mathematics of demolition. But mathematics meant nothing when you were working with salvage charges and prayers. The German patrol was close enough now that McNiece could hear individual words. Commands passed between soldiers who sounded as tired and nervous as his own men. The German patrol passed within 50 yards of their position, 3 soldiers in field grey uniforms picking their way along the creek bank. McNiece watched them through a gap in the collapsed stonework, noting their careful movements, the way they checked every shadow and pile of rubble. These weren't green troops. They moved with the wariness of men who'd learned that Norman hedgerows could hide paratroopers with knives and grenades. When the voices faded downstream, Carson motioned McNiece to continue. "How much time?" 3 minutes to finish the wire, maybe 2 more to reach minimum safe distance. But as McNiece worked, he could hear the tank engines growing louder, echoing off the stone walls of distant villages. The German armor was moving faster than intelligence had predicted, probably taking advantage of the scattered American drop to push through before organized resistance could form. Rodriguez managed to speak, his voice barely audible. "Sergeant, my gear! Explosives in my pack!" McNiece crawled over to check the private's equipment. Rodriguez had been carrying backup primers and a small block of TNT. Not much, but enough to strengthen the charges already placed. The kid's sacrifice might make the difference between a damaged bridge and a complete collapse. "Good man," McNiece whispered, transferring the explosives to his own satchel. Carson was studying his map, trying to coordinate with other scattered elements of the 506th over a radio that crackled with static and distant voices. "Baker Company made their objective," he reported quietly. "But Charlie Company is pinned down 2 miles south. We're on our own here." The morning fog was lifting now, revealing the full scope of the flooded Norman countryside. Paratroopers had landed in fields turned to swamps by weeks of rain, their equipment scattered across hedgerows and stone walls. What should have been a coordinated assault had become 100 separate struggles by small groups of men trying to complete impossible missions with whatever gear they could salvage. McNiece finished placing Rodriguez's additional charges, strengthening the weak points in the bridge's steel framework. The det cord ran true now, a lifeline of controlled destruction that could drop the span if everything went according to plan. But he'd learned in Sicily that plans rarely survived contact with reality. "Sergeant," Kowalski said, pointing east through the thinning mist. "Vehicles." In the distance, McNiece could make out the angular shapes of German armor moving along the road that led to their bridge. Probably a reconnaissance element, testing American strength before committing the main force. But even a few tanks could punch through the scattered paratroopers and reach the vital crossroads beyond. He thought about the other bridges he'd blown, in Sicily, at Anzio, during the long fighting up the Italian peninsula. Each one had been a calculated gamble, trading immediate tactical advantage against long-term strategic value. But this felt different, more personal. These weren't just coordinates on a map. They were his men, depending on his ability to read steel and stone and guess right about tonnage and timing. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The first German tank appeared through the morning mist, like a steel ghost, its angular turret swiveling as it approached the bridge. McNiece could hear its engine growling in low gear, the screech of metal tracks on the stone approach. Behind it, 2 more tanks followed, their commanders riding with hatches open, scanning for threats. Jesus, Kowalski breathed. Panzers. Carson was already on the radio, trying to coordinate with any American units in range. But the scattered drop had left communications spotty, and the nearest Sherman tanks were miles away, bogged down in flooded fields and narrow Norman lanes. McNiece crouched over his detonator, finger hovering above the plunger. The first tank was 50 yards from the bridge now, close enough that he could see the Wehrmacht crosses on its hull, the mud caked on its drive wheels. Everything depended on timing. Trigger too early, and the bridge might hold, allowing the tanks to cross on damaged but passable spans. Wait too long and risk losing the chance entirely. 30 seconds, he called to Carson. The tank commander was studying the bridge carefully, probably noting the obvious damage from the previous night's failed demolition. McNiece could see him talking into his throat microphone, likely reporting the situation to higher command. The Germans knew this was the critical crossing. Lose it, and their armor would face a 20-mile detour through country now swarming with American paratroopers. 20 yards from the bridge, the lead tank paused. Its commander was taking no chances, sending infantry forward to check for mines or demolition charges. McNiece watched German soldiers advance cautiously, their rifles ready, eyes scanning the creek bed where he and his men lay hidden. "They're checking the structure," Carson whispered. McNiece nodded, his hand steady on the detonator despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. He'd learned to control fear, to channel it into the precise calculations that kept explosives from becoming disasters. The charges were positioned correctly. He was sure of that. The question was whether Rodriguez's additional TNT would provide enough power to compensate for the materials lost in the scattered drop. The lead tank started forward again, its driver confident that the bridge would hold their weight. McNiece could feel the vibration through the ground as 30 tons of steel and armor approached his carefully placed charges. The det cord ran true beneath the muddy water, connecting his position to the explosives that would either save his men or doom them all. He thought about his father again, watching test welds fail under stress, learning that sometimes destruction was necessary before rebuilding could begin. The Norman countryside needed these bridges destroyed, but the cost would be measured in scattered paratroopers and desperate stands in flooded fields. The tank reached the bridge. McNiece counted 3 seconds, feeling the structure shudder under its weight, then pushed the detonator. The explosion came as a sharp crack, followed by a deeper rumble, composition B and TNT punching through the steel beam's weakened core. For a heartbeat, the span held, defying gravity and expectation. Then physics took over, and the bridge folded into the creek with a grinding roar that echoed across the Norman valleys. The lead tank disappeared in a cloud of dust and spray, 30 tons of German armor plunging into the flooded creek. As the bridge span twisted and collapsed beneath it, McNiece felt the concussion through the ground, his ears ringing from the explosion that had come closer to failure than anyone would ever know. What the after-action reports wouldn't record was the moment of pure terror when the charges fired but the steel held, suspended over the creek like a broken promise. For 3 endless seconds, McNiece had watched his careful calculations hang in the balance, knowing that if the bridge survived, the German tanks would cross, and his scattered men would be crushed against the Norman hedgerows. The second and third tanks had reversed frantically, their commanders realizing too late that the crossing was a trap. One tank threw a track in its haste to retreat, leaving it canted against a stone wall while its crew bailed out and ran for the tree line. The other disappeared back down the road, probably racing to report that the Americans still controlled the vital crossing. "Christ, McNiece," Carson breathed, staring at the wreckage of twisted steel and trapped armor. "How did you know it would hold just long enough?" The truth was that McNiece hadn't known. The bridge should have collapsed immediately when the charges fired, but something, wet det cord, insufficient explosive, or just the stubbornness of Norman engineering, had delayed the structural failure by just enough time to trap the lead tank. Pure luck disguised as expert timing. Rodriguez was conscious now, propped against the oak tree and staring at the destruction with wide eyes. "Sergeant, was that supposed to happen like that?" McNiece didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about all the ways it could have gone wrong. Charges misfiring, the tank commander's caution, the German infantry that had come within yards of discovering their position. Any one of a dozen variables could have turned the mission into a disaster that scattered the 506th and opened the road to German reinforcements. But what haunted him most was the sound the steel beam had made as it finally gave way, a grinding shriek of metal under impossible stress, like something alive crying out as it died. He'd heard that sound before, in Sicily and at Anzio, and he knew it would follow him long after the Norman campaign ended. "We need to move," Carson said, checking his map. "That explosion will bring every German patrol in 5 miles. McNiece helped Kowalski lift Rodriguez, fashioning a rough stretcher from parachute silk and broken planks. The private was tough. He'd make it to the aid station if they could avoid the German search teams now converging on their position. As they prepared to move out, McNiece took one last look at the collapsed bridge, the twisted steel jutting from muddy water like broken bones. The official report would describe a textbook demolition executed under difficult conditions. But he would remember the weight of that primer in his fingers, the sound Rodriguez made when he thought his leg was broken, and the way the steel beam seemed to hesitate before finally surrendering to carefully placed charges and stubborn determination. 3 weeks later, McNiece sat in a makeshift command post near Carrington, watching Lieutenant Carson complete the after-action report that would follow the bridge demolition up through regimental headquarters. The official language was clean and precise. Objective secured despite equipment losses, bridge destroyed, enemy armor denied crossing, mission successful. "That's it?" McNiece asked, reading over Carson's shoulder. "What else would you put?" Carson replied, not looking up from his typewriter. Sergeant McNiece got lucky when wet charges delayed long enough to trap a panzer. The report would become part of the growing legend around the Filthy 13, another story of impossible missions completed through skill and determination. But McNiece knew the weight of what those clean sentences concealed. The fear, the improvisation, the moment when everything balanced on the edge of disaster. Rodriguez had made it to the aid station and would eventually return to duty, his twisted leg healing properly thanks to quick medical attention. Kowalski had been reassigned to Baker Company after taking shrapnel during a patrol near Saint-Vith. The war moved on, consuming men and missions with mechanical efficiency. 2 months after Normandy, McNiece found himself crouched over another set of demolition charges, this time preparing to blow a canal bridge in Holland during Operation Market Garden. The Dutch countryside was different, flat and flooded, crisscrossed with waterways that could channel or trap advancing armor. But the mathematics of destruction remained constant: tonnage, pressure points, and timing. The young engineer who handed him the TNT satchel had heard stories about the railway bridge near Carrington, the impossible demolition that stopped German armor cold. "Think this one will go as smooth as that bridge in Normandy?" the kid asked. McNiece tested the weight of the charges, checked the primers, and thought about steel beams and the sounds they made when they finally surrendered to physics. "Every bridge is different," he said. "You just do your job and hope the math works out." Years later, sitting in a diner outside Ponca City, Oklahoma, McNiece would pause whenever freight trains rumbled across the railway bridge visible through the window. The sound of steel under stress always brought back that Norman morning. The fog lifting off flooded fields, the weight of Rodriguez's injured form, the moment when careful planning dissolved into luck and prayers. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, once asked him about the distant expression that crossed his face when trains passed. McNiece had started to tell her about bridges and demolitions, about young men scattered across foreign fields with too little equipment and too much responsibility. But the words felt inadequate, too clean to carry the weight of what they'd actually experienced. "Just remembering some work I used to do," he said instead, stirring sugar into his coffee. The official histories would record the successful demolitions, the tactical victories, the strategic importance of denying river crossings to enemy armor. But they couldn't capture the sound of steel giving way, the weight of a primer in trembling fingers, or the way a man carried those memories for decades afterward. If this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.